Hello and welcome to the January 2023 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest in this month's programme is David Ownby, who's Professor of the History of Religion in Modern and Contemporary China at the University of Montreal. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are available on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, so that you never miss a future episode. David has a piece in the current edition of Le Monde Diplomatique entitled Chinese Thinkers Debate Their Country's Future. The thinkers he has in mind are not the dissidents, who perhaps understandably receive the most attention in the West, but are silenced in China, nor are they the propagandists, who merely spout the party line. David's focus is on the sizable group of public or establishment intellectuals who have a platform in China and are able to think critically about their country's past, present and future, albeit within certain bounds. In his article in this month's paper, David discusses how these writers' views on China's role in a multipolar world is evolving. What's perhaps most significant about their work from a Western point of view is how little known it is here, something David has sought to remedy on his website, Reading the China Dream, which presents their ideas in English. Chinese ideas matter, he says, because China is a great power. When we spoke last week, David began by telling me how his interest in these thinkers began.
It was about 10 years ago. I was coming back from a conference in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I must have had nothing else to read except a Chinese book that a Chinese scholar had given me at the conference. I'd been reading Chinese because I'm a scholar of Chinese stuff all my life, but had never taken any particular pleasure in it. It's a difficult language. Most of the academic stuff I had read was good for the data it provided, but in terms of an argument or a style, didn't hit me where I live. This was a great book. I just opened it and started reading. It's a long flight, it's like 5 hours from Vancouver back to Montreal. It was a history book, so written in the same way that history books are written anywhere else in the world, with colorful characters and themes. And it was the first time that it happened to me. I might have been 50 or 55 at the time, like I said, after a long career doing this. And I was just amazed. I couldn't see any propaganda. I couldn't see where the party had intervened to tell the author, who became a friend of mine eventually, how to conclude. It was just a really good book. And eventually what hit me was how strange it was. I didn't know that existed. I mean, it could not be that I had found the only good Chinese book in the world. I mean, it could be, I guess, but that strains credibility, right? And finally, I said, well, if I didn't know this exists, maybe no one else does either, which again is a very strange thing to say to oneself. I don't have a huge ego, so I don't always think I'm discovering things that the world has ignored. But in this case, it turned out to be pretty much right. So it was that one incident, that one book, which pointed me down this road. What I did after that, I mean, I got other topics off my desk and I got a little bit of money from somewhere. And then I worked with the author of that book and put out a book of translations of his work. And I think I was extremely lucky to have chosen him. He's a brilliant writer. He's a very clear thinker. He's a liberal in a Chinese sense. And he's just very smart and balanced. So there was that project. And then I thought I was still hooked. It's a great pleasure to translate someone who writes well and to believe that you've done him proud. Then I worked through his footnotes. Like many of these public intellectuals, he has an academic side where he writes for his peers, and then he has a Times Literary Supplement side where he writes for the greater reading public. So those are the ones I was reading. I don't read his academic stuff. I read when he's writing to try to convince other Chinese people about this, that, and the other. And I didn't know the cast of characters that he was addressing in his book, so I had to learn about them to make sense of what he was saying. And then I went on to just go through his footnotes and read everyone who seemed to be interesting. And I translate it because I find that if I don't, it just gets away from me. Chinese, I've been studying Chinese for 45 years. I started in 1977, and it remains difficult. If I don't translate it, it just slips away. And then just translating little excerpts, little bits of it always seemed to me not very effective as a way of conveying what people were saying. So I just started down this project of translating whole pieces. And I just kind of got obsessed with it. So that's how it started. And then it's blossomed. I have kind of a two-handed approach. I have a series of projects where generally I choose an author and present a work or a series of translations of their work and write a big introduction to it to illustrate what a certain author says about certain things. And then I try to keep up just with what's going on day to day. My fiction is that I'm trying to sort of imagine what a Chinese person like me or like you, if they think they're pretty well, caught up with what's going on in the world and the press, that's what I try to find. And it's subjective, of course, because there's vast amounts of stuff which I can't possibly get to. But those are the two things I try to do.
You said you thought perhaps the book you'd found was unique and you weren't being serious, but it's not the case that the writers you're choosing are anomalies. You describe it as being a bit like a republic of letters. So it's not just a few isolated figures that you're managing to identify. You're actually tapping into a whole network of intellectual debates that are ongoing in China with scholars and writers and thinkers communicating to and with and taking up ideas or responding to each other. So that there's a sort of richness there. There's a depth to it. It's not just cases in isolation.
I don't have any trouble finding people to read. I have trouble finding new people because I don't know who they are. And reading headlines in Chinese it's kind of like getting Chinese humor. It's one of the last things you get to. But to give you an idea of the size of this, there's a website in China. It has a terrible title. It's called I Love Thought, which, makes me think of Hello Kitty whenever I think of it. But it's run at Beijing University. It's a repository for the writings of public intellectuals. And there are some 600 or 700 of them, which is an astonishing amount. And most of them, you'll find, 25, 30, or 50 texts for each author. So there are millions of pages. Now, not all of these are brilliant authors, and not every text is a brilliant text. There's repetition, there's schlock. But this is basically not propaganda. I've noticed in the last little while they've been putting Xi Jinping in there among the intellectuals. He wasn't there when I first started doing this. But they haven't gone through and taken out stuff that now would be seen as quite incendiary. I live in fear that someone will notice this site someday and say, get rid of that. But it's testimony to the fact that, yes, there is a huge republic of letters in China. I mean, if you Google Canadian public intellectuals, for instance, you get about 5 names. That's about it. And in China, there's 600 on this one website. So Chinese intellectuals complain constantly that they've lost the influence they used to have with the rise of the market, the rise of the internet. And I'm quite sure that's true. But it remains much closer. I mean, I think of France as having quite a healthy public intellectual space. China is that. That said, of course, there's some things they can't say, so let's not get overboard. But I think there's lots of them out there. Most of the people who wind up being well-known public intellectuals, and this is not surprising, are middle-aged or older. It just takes that amount of time to make your name, oftentimes. And so I'm trying to get a handle on younger generations, which takes a little bit of work. And I wonder if they're not migrating toward video or migrating toward podcasts, that writing perhaps will become relatively less important. And actually, some of my authors, the first author that I read and then I translated, went on to write about how people of his generation, he's my age, so he's 64, 5, 6, I don't know, how they communicate with younger Chinese who spend all their times on their phone. And it's really quite interesting what he had to say about it. So it may be the importance of this group may diminish over time, either because of political pressure, which there is a considerable amount of, or because of media trends, just make people write and read less. But for the moment in China, reading and writing remains an important thing. So I don't have any trouble finding interesting people to read.
I mean, you said that first book that really sparked your interest, you couldn't detect in it a sort of the heavy hand of censorship. Nonetheless, I wondered, do you have to learn to read between the lines when you approach this body of writing? You know, if you're coming to it cold, as it were, unprepared, is it difficult actually to tune in, if you're coming to it as an outsider, to tune in and actually get a grasp of exactly what the issues are that are at stake and how they're being framed and how they're being positioned in relation to, you know, the existing currents of debate?
Yes, you have to learn to read between the lines or to catch the references to other authors or texts. I remember we used to have I used to participate in sort of a translation group with graduate students in Canada and elsewhere. And their Chinese was perfectly good, but they couldn't tell what the authors were saying because they didn't know what they were saying. And it's not that it's totally opaque, but it is different enough from the way we discuss issues that, yeah, you need to be educated. One of the things I like about my website is I can direct people to other texts and say, I think this is interesting because he says this here, and you can compare it with what this other guy said over here. He's obviously picking up a thread from a debate there. It's not comprehensive, but translations are often, because translation is poorly viewed by the academy, they're often published in minor presses with small print runs. So no one ever sees them, right? I mean, somebody gets really into an author and publishes whatever they did on, say, the University of Kentucky Press. It's an actual example. I have nothing against the University of Kentucky Press. And then it'll print 500 copies and no one will buy it. And then there it is. On my site, I think I've got like 7,000 pages of stuff. You can, of course, no one will read that. It's testimony to my own obsession, but at least it's there. But yeah, it's coded to some degree. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was less coded. The Chinese intellectual world, prior to the rise of Xi Jinping, was pretty astonishing. We weren't paying much attention because we don't. But the things you could say in 2010 or 2012 about how the Communist Party system will simply not work, it's just amazing. It sort of frightens me when I happen to read something from that period. So that wasn't all that coded. You could be pretty open. And my author, whose name is Xu Jilin, the book that I read, the first one, was written in that period when he didn't have to worry all that much. For most of the 2010s, 2000s and 2010s, China was pretty wide open unless you got into serious trouble. So academics could say pretty much, not everything, but they could say a lot of things. So since I started there, when it started getting more heavily coded with Xi Jinping's rise, I had a leg up so I could understand what they were getting at.
So you're scanning a very big terrain, David. What is it that you're really looking for? What is it that jumps out at you and makes you think this is a piece, an article, a book that's worth delving into and perhaps bringing an extract into English?
That's the tough question, I must say. I look for things that surprise me, frankly. They stick their neck out in a way that I can't quite understand. They argue against the current in such a way as to avoid getting into trouble. I greatly admire the courage that these people display. I mean, I think if I were in China, I'd just stay home and not say anything important at all for fear of, getting in trouble, losing my pension, which is what happens if you play your cards wrong. But these people do not do that. I mean, they're not dissidents either. So some people will condemn them for not speaking truth to power. But speaking truth to power in China doesn't work. Dissidents get translated and admired, but they get put in jail or exiled. So they're trying to, walk a tightrope, sort of. And their goal is to convince other intellectuals to think as they do. And ultimately, if they're lucky, convince politicians to think as they do. That's what strikes my fancy.
And the preoccupying theme, at least in the pieces that you bring across into English, is China's role in the world, its future direction. Where is it heading? How has it got to where it is today?
Oh.
And how do Chinese people and intellectuals tell the story
Yes,
of
absolutely.
how it has got where it is today. And those are all very big and potentially quite sensitive questions, aren't
Oh,
they? But
indeed.
those are the kinds of things which they are grappling with. Even the writing of the past 60 years is far from straightforward, isn't it? There are all sorts of pitfalls or fissures in the debate that have to be navigated.
Absolutely. One way to frame this is that China's rise, which is a key word in the field, is start to get noticed about 2000, the year 2000 in China. Up until then, I remember I went to China very frequently in the 1980s and 1990s. And China was developing quickly, but it was such a mess, you just couldn't see it. I mean, it was just a construction site. About 2000 in the major cities, the dust settled and you could see what China had done. And it's whatever you think of China's system, it's astonishing what they've done in material terms. And the Chinese people, the Chinese intellectuals started to notice that in a serious way in the 2000s. There was also in the 2000s that their two major competitors, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and the United States, suffered downfalls of different proportions. I mean, the Soviet Union went away, and that was immensely frightening to the Chinese. And then the U.S. stumbles, and the West more broadly stumbles, being in 2008 with the financial crisis and Brexit and Donald Trump and all the rest. So for Chinese intellectuals, this was just a really electrifying kind of set of circumstances where China was achieving positive success in a way that was largely recognized by the rest of the world. I mean, they were on their way towards superpower status. So there was an air of optimism. And at the same time, Soviet Union was gone and the US was stumbling. So all those questions about what is China? What have we done? How did we get here? What happened in the 20th century? It was this whole range of questions that I think they legitimately opened up to and tried to explore. And I mean, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party have their own ideas about all this kind of stuff, but they would really like Chinese intellectuals to help them flesh it out. And that's what a lot of them try to do. Even people who don't like the government very much, who don't like the direction Xi Jinping is taking it, instead of, well, they can't really take pot shots from within China, but they many of them do what they can to try to say, look, you don't have a legitimate ideology anymore. I don't know if you know that or not, but I know that. And everyone I talk to knows that, the Xi Jinping speak doesn't make much sense to most Chinese people. Let us help you craft something that will work. I mean, that's what I think we usually miss when we look at China. You can be thoroughly critical as a Chinese intellectual of the direction in which the regime is going on a certain issue, like common prosperity or anything else, but you still want to help. I mean, Cold War, the heritage of the Cold War has made us think that you're either with the government or against it. You're either a propagandist or you're a dissident or you're too scared to say anything. And that just doesn't completely misread China, but it leaves out a huge chunk of people with whom we could have very fruitful dialogues if certain things got out of the way.
And it sounded from what you wrote that there was a strong cast of exceptionalism, Chinese exceptionalism, in a lot of the writers you talk about. Of course, China is not exceptional in having a tendency towards exceptionalism, but I wondered, in what ways does it manifest itself in the writers that you focus on? It seemed, from what you said, that they're sort of worrying away at it, in the way that a dog might worry at a bone, trying to work out what characterizes Chinese exceptionalism and therefore what China's destiny is if you follow through on those sort of basic tenets.
I think many Chinese feel in their bones that China is exceptional. And if you read over the course of China's history, well, that makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, China was the pillar of East Asia, dominated the entire region, much of the world for many years. And I think it really did come as a shock, the 19th century, when the Opium War and the rest, and China fell from grace so quickly. I think they felt that far more than, say, a Canadian would, or, a country, if you think of smallish countries next to big countries, if you think of Portugal or Canada, yes, they think they're exceptional, but not in the way the Chinese do. So, I mean, many of them, the instinctual thing to think when China started coming back from its century of humiliation and failure with China's rise was that we're doing this because we're unique. And as you said, they're trying to figure out what that means to be unique. And there are a series of answers that they give to that. There are what we call new Confucians in China who think that China is unique because of its Confucian heritage, and they need to accept that. The Communist Party needs to accept that and incorporate into its principles and its ideology those Confucian principles, which are sort of benevolent authoritarianism. And they can take that argument any number of different ways. There are other people who are, they call the New Left, and they've become very statist sort of people, propping up the party or trying to help the party elaborate an ideology which makes sense, not just the Communist Party ideology, emphasizing that China's greatness will lead it to be the superpower of the 21st century. And then there are the ones that I find more interesting are the liberals. And I think they're more interesting because I share their ideas for the most part. But also they're in kind of a defensive position now because they can't pound on the table and ask for human rights and constitutional democracy because they get in trouble for that. So they have to argue around the edges. And they're the ones who say things that I think are very sensible. The notion that China is unique makes some sense, but China needs to respect universal values at the same time. So what they want to argue is that there are any number of ways to be modern. China is one of those, and China needs to accept the rest of the world. The rest of the world needs to accept China, and China needs to make explicit what it is about China's modern experience that's worthwhile to the rest of the world. And that can be any number of things. So, yeah, in a nutshell, I think you're absolutely right. What they're trying to figure out is what that means. What is unique about China? It starts as a feeling, as almost everything does. And then they try to look elsewhere or look in the past or argue their way towards some version of what really explains why China is unique.
And do you see them developing a sense of what a multipolar world might look like when viewed from the vantage point of China? Is that another of the recurrent themes?
It is. I think there's a lot of debate in China over that theme. I think most Chinese intellectuals would endorse the multipolar world idea. Although not all Chinese intellectuals are anti-American, strangely enough. They can't come out and say they're pro-American, but it's very clear when you read through a lot of their texts that there's nostalgia for the period before the current impasse in Chinese-American relations, when the policy of engagement seemed to be making sense. I think lots of Chinese liberals in particular would prefer a world where Americans continue to lead, if not dominate, because they share the same basic values as Americans do. Multipolar is better than American hegemony. But I mean, on the other hand, there are any number of intellectuals whose bread and butter is attacking American hegemonism, which is not hard to do, actually.
And I wanted to ask, the body of thought, which is referred to as Xi Jinping thought, which is a sort of distillation of his pronouncements and speeches and statements, is that a sort of constant reference point, whether explicit or perhaps more often implicit, in the writings of the intellectuals you're talking about? I mean, is that the kind of doctrine that has to be taken into account, and any pronouncement a writer makes has to be aware of how their thought sits in relation to what is basically the sort of state policy on a range of critical issues?
I would say they pretty much ignore him, which astonishes me. Most of my authors do not mention him or his thought at all. Now, I don't read propagandists because enough people read them. Now and again I do, but that's not my focus, because it's easy to find articles in the People's Daily or the other propaganda organs who, of course, talk about nothing but Xi Jinping thought. But most of my authors, it's quite astonishing, do not mention him at all, even in contexts where I'm waiting for the Xi Jinping shoe to drop. They just don't drop it. And some of the things that they do to stick their neck out, it's precisely that, just talking right past Mr. Xi, when anybody else would have engaged. So that's one of the most striking things about the literature.
You said that 10 years ago, before Xi, things were much more relaxed. Do you see a gradual ratcheting up of, if not the sort of explicit controls, then the sense that isn't becoming more dangerous to talk too freely or to speculate too freely, even in these small circulation intellectual publications?
Yes, you can see it. I once compared the writings of one particular Chinese intellectual in, I think it was 2010, with what he wrote in 2020. And because of the website I mentioned a while ago, with all the intellectuals there, you can do this really quickly. You can go find them and read them really quickly. And there's a huge gap. There's a huge change. But it's not like, so he was one of the guys he's sort of this conservative liberal. Liberals like you would have found in the mid-19th century in England, libertarian liberals. He's one of those guys. So he's all about property rights. He likes Hayek. There's lots of these people in China. I mean, who knew? But anyway, he was writing in 2010 that because China was not going in that direction, failure within the next 30 years was almost a certainty. And he didn't mince words. I mean, he wasn't a dissident. He didn't call anybody out, but he just basically wrote as a political scientist. And then in 2020, he mentioned almost none of that kind of stuff. But he wasn't singing the praises of Xi Jinping either. He had moved on to artificial intelligence as his main focus. So and that's what a lot of them kind of do. If you can't talk about something, if you're getting in trouble, it's not like you just shut up. You find something else that you can talk about. And his themes, this author, his themes remained democracy, good government, and what artificial intelligence were going to do to that in China and elsewhere. I found it less compelling than his stuff in 2010, but still, it wasn't that he knuckled under. He just thought up something else, or it might have been a natural evolution of his thought. I didn't read everything between 2010 and 2020.
What do you think, David, may be at stake if we don't pay any attention to these writers? I mean, you're doing sterling work, and I hope it is reaching an English-speaking readership. But if we're not, if broadly speaking, we're not really paying much attention to Chinese intellectual life, do you think there are potential real-world consequences, or do these writings fall into the category of kind of nice to read, but not necessary to read?
I think it's important because it humanizes them. I think there's a very real failure on the part of Western media, or the West in general, to acknowledge China as being made up of people who are pretty much like you and me. China has been the other forever. There's racism in there. There's the Cold War in there. There's the fact that they eat with sticks and speak a language that's very hard to understand. That's what I feel like when I read these people, that this is someone I could sit down and talk to. And I'm quite sure that intellectuals in most Western countries could sit down and have a perfectly good talk with many Chinese intellectuals in ways that they do not imagine. Governments, both in China and elsewhere, are in the way of that. But we're just not recognizing the humanity of China. That's sad from just a sort of human point of view, but it also means we're ignoring part of what makes them what they are. I mean, they are smart and very sophisticated. They know vastly more about us than we know about them. Just from a strategic point of view, we should know that. We should know how smart they are. And that the smart is not limited to espionage or planning our demise, that they are using their brains in ways that we use our brains, that there are intellectuals in China who've had decades-long careers doing fascinating work and not just reading the People's Daily and applying Xi Jinping thought to teaching mathematics or whatever you might do. So, yeah, I think there's some real-world consequences.
From what you're saying, it makes the two-dimensional, or it's a step towards making the two-dimensional into properly three-dimensional.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to put it, yeah.
I was speaking to David Ownby, whose piece in this month's paper is entitled Chinese Thinkers Debate Their Country's Future. You can read his article at multipolar.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper, going back 25 years, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, There's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one, including the full archive of this podcast. You'll find all previous episodes on Le Monde Diplomatique's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app to make sure you don't miss future ones. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.